So the second question I have is you mentioned subleasing a ton throughout the book, and you mention it as a common practice in the warehouse leasing business. Can you explain why subleasing is prevalent and the groups or entities that normally seek out subleasing properties?
Yeah, happy to. When you lease a building, that's a contract that you have that gives you
Yep.
the rights to be in a certain property. And so when things change, right? So you imagine the duration of a lease, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And then you think of the things that change in the world, right?
Yeah.
So the economic cycle, the debt cycle, and then whatever business you're in, that business cycle. And so change in business happens faster than the lease contract. And so anytime you have a change that warrants or necessitates you changing the space that you need, that's when subleasing is a tool that can help people. And so subleasing, all it is just finding someone for your contract so that you're free to move
Mm,
on and go find something that's smaller or larger. And so the normal, like a bread and butter sublease is just, I've grown, I'm in 50,000 feet, I need 100,000 feet. So I'm going to find someone who needs my 50 and I'm going to go out and get 100. I think some of the challenges in the concept of subleasing and why there's a chapter here and why there's a moment to stop and pause before starting the sublease journey is that with any sublease, you go from having two parties, which is you as the tenant and the landlord, to having three
right.
parties, which is who you've sublet to, yourself and the landlord. And so anytime you have three parties, that's three alignment of interests. That's three parties to the contract who have an opinion, who have a say. And it surprisingly makes it harder. It's more
Yeah.
difficult, even though it's oftentimes of less value because it's for the remainder of a contract. There's less dollars on the line, but that doesn't mean it's of lesser importance. And so it happens often. And so that in the chapter, I've just framed out some of the things that you can start to understand to frame things up to then walk the path on the subleasing journey.
Interesting. You mentioned earlier that kind of businesses are making decisions maybe 5 or 10 years in the past. And in the last 5 years, obviously the world has changed dramatically. So would you say that subleases have dramatically increased pre and post COVID?
Yeah, I would for sure. Not only is subleasing a way to deal with the change in the economy and with change in the business cycle and how to align that with the contract for the space. That's for companies that have a contract that need to shed space. The flip side is for every company that's doing that, who is taking the
Yeah.
remainder of a contract. If there's 1 or 2 or 3 years left on a contract, the great part is that can allow people in a transition or in a business cycle are new, are starting up, are raising money, or who are making short-term bets during that economic cycle to still access the market, still gain a foothold into space, and then still operate and scale their operation. And so not only is it more prevalent because we've had a transitory time where there's been a lot of change, that's also allowed for new companies and new opportunities for people to go short in the space and test their business model and to grow in areas to see if that's going to be like a sustained growth effort.
Sure.
And that has been not only increasing in 2020, 2021, and 2022, but in 2023, if you think of things cooling down a bit, that's its own
Hmm.
version of change. We have all watched since maybe October of 2022, like the rise of increased sublease space as things have cooled a little bit with all of the Fed interest rate increases. How much will there be is a great question that we're all like factoring in and just being like a mindful of.
Yeah. I guess when you look at typical length of a sublease, is it generally a month's thing or is it kind of years? And do they carry out the duration of the prior lease?
Yeah, so definitely years as opposed to months in the majority of instances. Oftentimes, why is that? The cost of subleasing. Part of that is the fee, like paying a fee to sublease space, but a lot of it comes down to the expense of moving and of setting up a new facility. Usually there you need time to break even and to profit from like any venture that involves moving into a building. And then when it comes to, do you fulfill the full contract term, was the second part of your question. You don't really have to. You can. It's most common to, but in some instances, you'll have a 5-year lease, you're 2 years in, so there's 3 years left. And some companies will say, hey, it's slow right now. I don't have inventory in that half of the building. How about I'll sublease half of the building out for this year,
Mhm.
and I'll wait and see if in a year, if I need it again, then I can say, hey guys, you were storing overflow inventory in that space. I need it back. It's the end of our 1-year agreement. I'm going to make use of that space again. And so that's a great way where someone who has space for a long period of time can build in some internal flexibility without having to move and downsize. The flip side of the question on, do subleases go the length of the contract, is sometimes who wants to sublease your space wants it longer than what you have left. And so if you have this hypothetical 5-year contract and you're 2 years in and you have 3 years left to go, it can be normal for people to want a fresh new 5-year contract. And so how does that work? And so that comes back into this idea of having 3 parties to the lease, and it's almost run in parallel. Well, where you'll have the new group who wants a 5-year lease, and they'll need to sign a new 5-year lease with the landlord. And the landlord will need to sign a termination with the current tenant that's in the building. And only after the new tenant has signed a lease and given a check, and the old tenant has signed a termination and given a check, can the landlord have 2 contracts in their hand, 2 checks in their hand, and they can sign them both at the same time, that frees one tenant and obligates the new one, so that there's no risk to the old tenant. That's how lease terminations can work, that it's like a simultaneous kind of signing of the contracts.